Let not the cooings of the world allure thee. Which of her lovers ever found her true? Edward Young. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me, and if for any new people, welcome in. I hope you enjoy. I hope you go back and listen to our backlog. And for my returning listeners, thank you as always. So I don't have much to go over in terms of corrections or too much in terms of clarifications. I feel like I've been pretty good and seems to mostly have been clear. So I'm going to go ahead and get started for this, our final episode for Europe for the 8,000 to 6,000 BCE time frame. And when I say, of course, we'll be talking about the British Isles, and that is also Ireland. And to start with that, we're going to do, of course, some etymology. Now, the name Britain comes from the Latin Britannia, which came from Greeks who used something close to Pretaneke, which was with a P-R-E. But I guess hearing that kind of evolved over time to Brit instead of Pret for the Latins. And this is apparently the Greek version, Pretaniki, or Britannici. This is apparently a loan word from a Celtic, Pritani, which meant either something like painted or tattooed people. So fairly straightforward. Then you have Ireland, which is a combination of land and a corruption of the Old Irish Ir, which is the land of Ir. Now, the origin of that term is very usually linked to there's an Old Irish pagan goddess, Iru, and there are other names that are used for both of these islands and island chains, of course, but we will talk more about those names as well as the goddess in future episodes. But that's kind of the main point of etymology. But that does remind me, someone had asked why I didn't go into the etymology of France. It's kind of I have chosen not to fully break down the etymology of everything, but France isn't going to be used for that region until a lot later. Whereas I feel like Britannia and Ireland, those are kind of longer lasting terms, in my opinion. I think Britannia is used well before France is used to talk about that region. And again, kind of like the term Italy, it did not expand until later. And the people living in France kind of did not live just in France. There's some overlap between the Iberian Peninsula, Germany, and Italy, and then, that kind of thing. So I understand it's kind of arbitrary, but it is my decision. But I will, of course, go into all that. And I'll probably talk about the etymology of places that we've already done before. I'll probably review. I might expand. Who knows? There might be more theories to dive into. But France comes from people known as the Franks, and we'll talk more about them later. That's another reason I didn't dive too much into it, because the Franks are a very specific people you can talk about, but they're nowhere close to existing as a identifiable group. Whereas here, there's a little bit more stuff we can kind of dive into, but yeah. That's the reason. And again, I understand it's arbitrary. I fully acknowledge that, but it kind of is what it is. Not that many people have complained. I just had a couple of people ask about it, so that's why. But we do need to talk about the state of these islands. Now, As we've talked about several times this season, the Younger Dryas has a very big impact on the state of the world, and we are at a point where that has ended somewhere between 17,000 to 15,000 years prior to the start of this season. And temperatures worldwide, of course, become very close to what they are today, with a few notable exceptions. And one of those exceptions is the island of Britain. Temperatures there were hotter than they are today, which you kind of surprised me thinking about it, because Britain's more north than a lot of other places in Europe. But I think it has to do with how the ice caps melting. I didn't quite understand it, but I think it has to do with the ocean currents. They kind of sped up and pushed warmer air. If you've ever looked at a map for how the currents circulate, I think warmer air was pushed higher at this period, which is part of the reason the ice caps melt. But of course, as time goes on, that kind of levels out to make it more evenly distributed across Europe. That's kind of my rough understanding. And again, I have no basis of weather expertise, but that's kind of what I got from looking at maps and reading about it. So, and again, this is not a long thing. This does not last. This period where the temperatures were hotter than they are today does not last long. And it's not that much hotter. We're talking maybe 10 degrees at the hottest, and it's, we're talking probably average maybe, 2 to 3 degrees more, or 2 or 3 degrees warmer than what you would see today regularly. But what this does with the retreating ice caps, this makes the environment and the weather really conducive to birch trees. So this is a huge explosion of birch forest kind of growing, all through the island. Minus places, of course, where you have rivers run through, mountainous regions, hilly regions, and you have marshlands and things like that where birch trees aren't, it's not conducive to grow them quite as well. But birch trees are kind of the first big pieces of vegetation to return to the islands after the end of the Younger Dryas. Then sometime around 6,300, 6,200, give or take, a century or so, there is a very, bad cold snap. And that gets, I think, temperatures down to, on average, 5 to 10 degrees colder than they are on average now. And this cold snap lasts for about 150-ish years. Not that long in the grand scheme of things, but it's during this time that pine trees and some other kind of those evergreen things, like maybe alder, I think, is another tree that's that this colder weather is more conducive to, and that kind of thins out the birches a little, and it allows these pines and these other trees to kind of take over. And after this cold snap, the temperature evens out close, very close to what it is today. And it is, it's at that point, that the trees and the vegetation kind of begins to make its, begins to kind of correct to the temperature. Now, I couldn't get firm information on this, but Ireland is probably seeing very similar climate and ecological patterns. Ireland still has some forests and things like that, but they're not quite as extensive as England is. This is due to a number of reasons that we'll get into later. But they do have very similar kind of weather patterns for the most part, and this probably led to some similar levels of vegetation and things like that. Of course, there are differences, but again, we'll dive more into that later. Now, in Britain, in terms of natural resources, there are herd animals like reindeer and wild horses, of course, during that that last glacial maximum, Younger Dryas period, and these begin to disappear in the archaeological record. Of course, when you find like sources of like human refuse and debris, reindeer, wild horses, they completely disappear from animal bone records. So that's understandable, of course, with the climate changing, and of course humans, knowing how to hunt those animals quite well. If they weren't extinct because of the change in the environment, they were shortly, done in by the humans after the environment had damaged, of course, the environmental change, of course, damaged their numbers too. There's no doubt. It's a combination of factors. It's not just humans hunting these animals to extinction. So horses do exist all across the Eurasian steppe, but of course they die out on. I think they're almost completely gone. All the wild versions are gone, at least in Central and Western Europe. They might have been maybe in Poland and things like that, but of course they're still existing in the steppe and what is now like Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, that kind of things. So a very smaller range west of the Urals, whereas in the east, in the Urals and Central Africa, or not Central Africa, excuse me, Central Asia, of course, you still have a lot of wild varieties of horses. Sorry, I lost my place. Oh, so while those herd animals are disappearing, you do see the rise of more solitary animals, things like boars, deers, and elks, and you have several types of deer, red deer. I think they have whitetail variety. I think a blacktail as well. But you have a few different species of deer, elks, and those can kind of herd up during periods, but for the most part they kind of live in much smaller groups than what you're talking about for the reindeer and horses and things like that. Though I should point out that larger animals like deer don't appear in the archaeological record in Ireland until around 4000 BCE, for whatever reason. Now, they could have been existing in very small numbers, or it's possible that humans just weren't interested in beginning to hunt the deer until that point in time. But why they show up then and not earlier is a matter of debate. Some people think they may have swam from some smaller islands that were maybe still visible, or possibly had hopped remnants of ice sheets, or it's possible that some humans coming from Scotland or Wales or England or wherever, or the modern countries that occupy those places, they may have brought deer over to kind of populate. They may have understood that you bring deer to this island where no other predator except for you live. You can at least have some wild, free range herd animals. But again, that's debated and kind of talked about at length. Again, that's just in Ireland. Of course, all those things are existing in Britain. Now, in addition to the growth of the new forests, wetlands expand as well, and this becomes a home for a ton of different waterfowl, and marine life obviously will flood those areas pretty quickly. And we also talked about it last week, but the land bridge connection between Britain and mainland Europe may still exist at the end of our season, but it is becoming a much more narrow strip of land, and the rest of this this land pathway, Doggerland, as it is called, sinks or is sinking beneath the waves, or has sunk, again, in the situation of most of it. And of course, the land bridge between Ireland and Britain probably disappeared even before the start of the Younger Dryas. I think the most common time estimate would be something like the year 14,000 BCE or BC. Though it is possible, that there were, sizable icebergs or maybe ice sheets still in the sea, again, between those two land masses, to well after this period. It's debated. But that is one of the reasons why it's suspected that Ireland does not have near the number of things like reptiles that Britain does, at least naturally. Basically, the theory is that Ireland's cut off from mainland Europe before it's warm enough for animals and things like that, snakes and lizards and things like that, to survive fairly well. So that's the primary theory, at least, that I was able to read. All right, and now let me just make sure. Got my notes here. Yes, okay, so now we need to talk about the people living in these various islands. And I'm going to start with Ireland. And we talked about this a little, I think, the last time we were in Europe at the 10,000 BC season. Ireland had probably been occupied, at least for short periods of time, in very small numbers by Homo sapiens before this. Of course, the exact time frame this would have been is very highly debated, and there are a handful of artifacts that are older than 20,000 years. But some of these could have easily been carried to the islands by tides or by ice sheets, catching things that are in the water and, further south, and then as they're retreating, they're pulling them up. But there's not this. If the humans are living in Ireland at this early period, they're not living there in very huge numbers, and it does not last for very long. It's not long enough for them to make a massive impact in the archaeological record. But regardless, Ireland is apparently abandoned during the Younger Dryas, when, however long it had been occupied before then, however frequently. During that period, there are no humans. There is no evidence of them. They don't show up again in the archaeological record until around 7,500, 7,300, somewhere in that time frame. People begin to return, and these people are very much in the older Mesolithic hunter-gatherer mindset, and their tools mostly reflect this almost perfectly. They use very large stone-flaked hand axes, though they do polish these stones a little bit more than I think was common for other Mesolithic groups. And that might be due to the nature of where they're getting their stones. Maybe they're getting them from rivers and things like that, or somewhere where the tides are regular. But they also use odzies, or adze. And what these are, this is a slightly newer tool. It shows up a lot in early Neolithic settlements as well. And what this is it's a newer type of tool, and there are a number of places where the adze shows up. And essentially, the easiest way to probably think about this is essentially a wooden hoe. They aren't using stones to make hoes, but they're using instead wood. And what they're using the adze for, not necessarily to till the land or the dirt, but they're usually using them to maybe level things out for, maybe putting down a tent or things like that. They're using them to pry possibly mussels and things limpets. I think I mentioned in the Iberian episode, like barnacles. Limpets are very similar to barnacles, and they may have been using them to pry those animals off of the rocks to get them out and get them to where they can be opened up and eaten. And this appears to be a homegrown invention. This doesn't seem to be something they're picking up from anywhere else. And then when I say that, I mean in terms of their stone tools. They have a very, static tool tradition. It doesn't seem to change much until much later. And there's no pre-industry. There's no earlier type of tools that show up in any number. Again, because Ireland hasn't been inhabited at large scale, or at least at any real scale above a handful of groups, maybe. But they don't show up with an earlier tradition and then begin to evolve this. They are using the same tools throughout this period. They show up with them there, and these type of stone tools don't appear to be connected necessarily with any earlier tradition. The Ahrensburg, the one in that North Germany, lowlands, very south east of Britain, that kind of thing. So just keep that in mind. Now, and it's also it appears to be completely unrelated to the people living in Britain at this time. The Isle of Mann, though, which is that island kind of off the kind of to the north of what is modern day Wales, kind of where Scotland kind of in the southwest, there's like an island. It's called the Isle of Mann. It does appear that they have the same type of tools as you will see in Ireland. However, there's no sign of anyone living on the Isle of Mann until around 6,500 to 6,000 BCE. So it's likely that peoples from Ireland are the first people to colonize that island, at least as far as we can tell. So, again, the stone industry, Ireland only, and Man, Ireland and Man. So, just keep that in mind. And, of course, they also use stone and, other stone tools and bone tools, very simple things. But, that's kind of what stands out about them. Now, the homes, we have found some preserved parts of their homes and things like that, but they were all built out of temporary material. And most of their sites appear to be seasonal. Their homes are usually made out of reeds, and they're kind of layered to kind of be like oblong domed almost. And of course, they would use animal skins and hides stretched over woods to cover holes, and of course to make tents. They're building a couple different kinds of semi-permanent or settlements or houses. And they also made simple boats, very similar to canoes. They clear out tree trunks, and these were used to get fish and the like, just offshore or to kind of travel upriver quickly. And fish and things like that are a huge part of the diet of people living in Ireland. Though they're not just living on the coasts and the rivers. They did move inland along the river systems. And then, they would probably go to nearby woods and things like that from the rivers, and they would get things like wild nuts and things like that. And that's kind of that's the most nuts are a very big component of the plants they're harvesting. There's nothing like wheat or any kind of wild grass like that they would have even been able to harvest. They wouldn't even have been able to attempted to domesticate crops in that nature. I suppose they could have tried to domesticate trees, or maybe I think there are some fruit like berries that were edible, but there's no evidence that they even begin to attempt that. They're just harvesting wild versions of those plants. Now, most of the sites at this period are in the southeast of the island, near, I think, the modern city of Cork. But there are some sites found in kind of the northeast, and these are much smaller. And I don't know that they're at this, if they're at these sites for the full duration of this period. They may have been, again, seasonal. They may have been attempts by humans to maybe expand there, but it didn't quite work out, at least not all at once. They may have had to make a couple of attempts. It's hard to really say. But the population for the island of Hull is probably very small, and it will probably remain small. I think at this early stage, this early junction that we're talking about, there's probably no more than 10,000 people on the whole island. And again, it stays this way for a while. I think until the mid 4000s, or maybe even early 3000s BCE. And also there is and the reason that we think this is because there is a really big gap in the archaeology in Ireland. We have these early burials and tools, at mid 7000s BCE, so 7500, 7250, right in there. You have a lot of these tools, that kind of thing, everything I've talked about. And then there's some, you find refuse sites and things like that that can be dated to around 6000 BC, right at the end of their season. After that, though, they found almost nothing. So there's like a gap between 6000 BCE until, again, right around 4500 to 4000 BCE. Then we find tools again. And the tools are, very similar, if not identical, to the tools at the start of this culture, this early Irish culture, the 7500 to 7300. So again, there's no major innovation. There doesn't appear to be any new types of tools brought in just yet. So why is there this gap in the archaeological record? And it's a very interesting couple of theories on that. But as it is taking place next season, we're gonna have to leave it a mystery for now. So this is a hook. I'm gonna try to get you guys coming back for more for this one. Not gonna dive too much into it. So if you want to know what happens, you have to come back next season to talk about Ireland at our next time period. Now, to talk about Britain at our time frame. So, prehistoric Britain, of course, sorry, I'm getting all the notifications right now from work stuff, even though it's Sunday evening. So that'll be fun to deal with tomorrow. So I've talked about the animals showing up, the changes to the environment. But Britain also has some other advancements that show up for the first time in the archaeological record. And again, Britain was occupied before the Younger Dryas, and during the Younger Dryas, if people remained, they're just stuck in a very localized area in the southeast of the country, right in that Doggerland area. But dogs appear to show up a lot more frequently in the archaeological record at this point. So domesticated dogs definitely are in Britain by this point. Now, they are a little bit further along in terms of stone technology. They are kind of in a transitory period almost between the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and this Neolithic hunting-gathering tool set. So their blades are becoming smaller, more specialized. They're not using the larger stone heads. They're using the smaller ones for things like deers. They're probably using spears with barbed points so they don't just fall out. They kind of stay in there and kind of tear. They're eating a lot of waterfowl, things like wild ducks, probably, I think, swans are at this point in the area, geese, that kind of thing. But they also, of course, have plenty of rabbits and things like that. And then there's even wild cattle here too, aurochs, which I don't believe there's any evidence of those in Ireland at this point. I could be wrong about that, though. They're, of course, using flint, which is pretty important, especially for the... I think flint's a little bit easier to make those microlithic style tools at. They also have adzes that show up in the archaeological record, and that's again one of those wood-based tools as opposed to just stone and wood. But it's a very specialized type of tool as opposed to a spear or a bow or an arrow. They can be used to just basically kill anything, whereas the adze it's not necessarily a weapon at any point. It's used specifically for controlling land or getting specific foodstuffs, which again is very very something that's happening in a lot of other places in the world. And this kind of tool industry is getting spread all across the British Isles. It's not just in England. It is now in, of course, what is modern Scotland and parts of Wales as well. Now, their homes are a little bit different. These people appear to stay in places a little bit more or a little bit longer than what they're doing in Ireland. So they're not moving quite as often, but they are still moving. They have found kind of like early, very early. They're not villages, not really, because they're just homes, but there are places. I think in Sheffield they have found several different huts, and I think they found some around 25 like fire pits, kind of all in a group. So little huts, maybe housing anywhere between 2 to 5 people, maybe a little bit more, depending on the size of the floor plan, which can be debated. And they're all fairly close to water, rivers, things like that. They're not in marshes, I think, directly, but they are in some cases on the borders of marshes and things like that. And these people, again, they are still fairly mobile, but they're not as mobile as the Irish. They appear to work seasonal, I guess, seasonal food sources. They alternate. They have a very wide skill set, essentially. They're probably hunters, during certain periods of the year. They're fishers in others, and then at other times they are, almost probably 75-80% hunter-gatherer, gatherers. They're focusing on getting resources from plants and things like that, trees. And of course, they probably have wild berries in addition to a lot of different types of nuts. I think hazelnut is one that they found a good bit of evidence for. Also, there tends to be barriers between several different groups. People aren't traveling super long distances. They're within. They're all very regional based. Like it appears like one group had like their river, their forests, their marsh, and they would kind of alternate, and then another group would have their river, their marsh, that kind of thing. Just bear in mind, though, that might not be quite as clear cut, but that's what the evidence, at least that we've found, seems to show. Now, there has been some DNA found in some people from this period of time. And that is, of course, the famous Cheddar Man. And Cheddar is the name of the... There's a gorge called Cheddar Gorge. I think it's in the... I forget the name. I think it's Somerset. But there's like a bay between Wales and Cornwall, and I think Cheddar Gorge is kind of in that area. And that name, interestingly enough, comes from the Old English Ceadr, which is something like ravine or a cavity or pouch, something like that. And of course, that evolved over time to cheddar. The region's known for having a lot of really good cheeses, at least that are produced in England. So it was kind of known for that in the region. So cheddar cheese is from that region. That's where the term cheddar arose from. But they found the Cheddar Man in a gorge, kind of in the wild there, and he was discovered. I think it was. Hold on, I have it written down in my notes somewhere. No, wait, sorry. That's when they did the DNA test. When did they find him? I could have sworn I wrote that down. 1903. That's it. 1903. Now, the DNA test, I think they have done a couple of rounds on Cheddar Man. One in 1997 and the other in, I think, 2017. And that one has led to a little bit of a controversy that we'll get into here in just a second. But I do want to remind people, if you need to, you can go back to listen to the 10,000 BCE for Europe. There were a couple episodes there. I talked about how Europe, at least from the initial wave of Homo sapien arrival, kind of divided into two groups, the Eastern and Western hunter-gatherers. The Western hunter-gatherers could have dark to lighter brown skin, and they also apparently had a proclivity to having lighter color eyes, blue or green. And then in the Western hunter-gatherers, the Eastern hunter-gatherers, you tended to have lighter skin and lighter hair. But they did, again, keep, apparently, had a high probability for brown eyes, at least comparatively to the Western hunter-gatherers. So, in the 2017, testing, they had a number of, they basically compared Cheddar Man's DNA with DNA from a number of different ethnic groups, and samples from all over the world, and they kind of compared his DNA to everyone else, basically line by line, essentially, like, okay, based on, this, he had DNA matching almost perfectly with people with blue eyes and all this other stuff, and what his hair may have been like, and then they compared to what his skin may have been like. they did a facial reconstruction based off what they found, and this reconstruction kind of created a little bit of a firestorm in Britain. And when this was announced, I think it was 2018. So you had a lot of conversation at the time. How accurate is this really? Because there were people calling him the first Briton, and he had black skin, and this was kind of seen as like some people, using this as kind of like a, an argument against like anti-integration, anti-Brexit, propaganda. Some people accused, basically made the accusation, and it's all kind of, basically the media kind of ran with this, and I do think there was, a little bit of maybe the scientists who did the kind of study maybe trying to get a reaction, get their names out there, get a, kind of make a big splash, because it was a fairly important thing. And, there's always a certain level of subjectivity with art. And this is, these facial reconstructions, to an extent, they are, they're part science, but they're also part art. And, quite frankly, the Cheddar Man reconstruction is not very flattering to Cheddar Man. It essentially looks like he is a European. Like he looks like that he would be white, except they've essentially just given him blackface, in my opinion. That's what it looks like to me. He looks like someone who is wearing blackface. Now, part of that might be because, I am not used to seeing a person with black skin have blue eyes naturally. Obviously there are contacts. I have seen people with darker skin with green eyes that are natural, but blue eyes, it's eerie. It's off-putting. Like it's just, it's something I've never seen before. Right? It would be something that would never occur to me that could happen naturally. But DNA evidence tends to show that it could happen, that the genes that cause blue eyes and the genes that cause darker skin are not necessarily mutually exclusive. That being said, if you actually dive into what the DNA testing revealed about his skin color, they actually say that there was a 75% chance he had dark to black skin, whereas he had a 25% chance of having medium to light brown skin. Now, those terms are not very scientifically accurate. What is dark skin to someone may not, could be considered light skin to someone else. I feel like they probably would have been better served, scientifically speaking, to have maybe had a reconstruction based on, maybe a range of what his skin tone may be. Maybe he had the darkest skin tone, maybe what the lightest it could have been. Because I have a feeling, and this is just me from kind of reading about this stuff, and again, we've talked about this before. Lighter skin typically did not become really widespread until populations switched to agriculture. And if they're living in further northern latitudes. Just because you're not getting direct sunlight and you don't have enough vitamin D. So you need lighter skin to pull more vitamin D from the sun, which is the current scientific, consensus, or at least the most popular theory of how white skin evolved, or lighter skin, because it's, again, skin tone's a range. There's no one, it's not black and white, literally. There are, thousands of hues of skin. I think it would have been better if they had given a range. And there are some pictures that some people have done that they've adjusted the color. They've kind of changed it to or changed the saturation of the pictures to give examples of what lighter skin would have looked like based on the DNA test. Again, he definitely had brownish skin. The question is, how dark is that compared to sub-Saharan Africans or modern-day Europeans? I feel like it'd probably be closer to someone maybe from the Middle East or maybe southern India. But again, that's just my understanding of the DNA and how the environment would affect skin colors for that population as a whole. It doesn't really matter. This is just people fighting about stuff on the internet just based on very small parts of evidence. It would be very helpful, obviously, if we could test other Britons or Europeans living at around that same period. And again, I think I said 7,500. I think some more recent carbon dating stuff has shown it could even be 1,000 years earlier than that, give or take. Excuse me. So it's possible he's just before our time period, but he's close enough that I did want to talk about him. And he's a famous, he's one of the more famous finds in archaeology. In terms of size, he was around 5 feet 5 inches, which is like 165 meters, or I'm not 100, sorry, 1.65 meters. And he probably didn't weigh more than 150 pounds. But, for that time, for hunter-gatherers, he was probably in decent enough shape. He may, of course, wanted more food, but, there doesn't appear to have been too much wrong with him, with the exception of what probably killed him. He does appear to have died a violent death. Now, what that means doesn't really give me too much of an answer. He did have like a really big kind of impact right above his right eye, and it appears to have maybe been infected. So he could have died from a fever, or he may have been injured and he just never had a chance to recover, and he just got sick and passed away. But he was a young man. I think he's only in his 20s when he dies. So now there is another interesting factor in his burial. A lot of other sites dating to around this period do show, when people are buried in these caves, which is normal, being found in the cave, fairly common. There are a lot of communal burials, and we've talked about this in other places. Groups tend to bury people communally. He is found alone. There's no one else in the cave that with him. There's a cave not far from where he was, where they found, I think, around 25 individuals or so. So he's buried alone, which has led some people to believe that he may have gone to that cave after he was wounded, and he may have just died there, and he just naturally over time his remains got buried in the cave just through the passage of time. Which is, that's pretty sad, honestly. I do hope that he was at least with someone. I hope he wasn't forgotten or lost to whoever his family may have been. He's younger than I am now, thinking about it, so that's just one of those little sad facts that you sometimes get across in archaeology and history. And speaking of him and his family, they are part of the U haplogroup, which is a mitochondrial DNA haplogroup, which again is the female ancestry that shows up in both male and female descendants. U is a fairly widespread haplogroup. It emerged in what is now, I believe, West Asia, which is, Middle East and Holy Land, Anatolia, somewhere probably in that region. And it emerged, or so the last common female ancestor that is, I guess, the grandmother of this group, one of the daughters of one of Eve's daughters, if we remember our mitochondrial Eve our mitochondrial Eve discussion. She lived somewhere between probably, I believe, 49,000 to 43,000 years ago, which again, you have to remember that they can't accurately date this because you have to do averages of lifespan, generations, all that kind of stuff. So it's hard to know exactly when. But she was probably, if not out of Africa at that point, she was living close, probably close by it in the Middle East, somewhere along those lines. Now, of course, there are subgroups, so, eventual daughters of her daughters, or so on and so forth, generations removed. She had daughters who themselves became common ancestors for a number of different populations. U5 is the one we're going to be referring to now. And this is also a fairly widespread haplogroup, so these daughters, ancestors ended up in a lot of places. The Western hunter-gatherers, who, remember, are the majority of the Gravettian population in the West. Again, the people who had the tendency to have the lighter eyes and darker skin, or at least darker than the Eastern hunter-gatherers, the Eastern European hunter-gatherers. They're almost all U5, if not all. I think they probably are all U5 descendants. In today's world, I think most of these descendants, or direct descendants, would be people like the Sami, the Finns, and the Estonians in Northern Europe. But there are also some parts of Southern Europe where you do have people who actually have majority U5 ancestry. And those are the Basques and the Cantabrians, which are sub-populations of the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, Basques, they are in parts of southern France and northern Spain. And then you have the Cantabrians, who are also in northern Spain, though a slightly different part of Spain. I think they're a little bit further to the west than the Basques. So, excuse me, you have in modern populations in Europe, there is some level of ancestry to pretty much all Europeans who have some U5 ancestry. Now, how closely related, whether they're direct descendants of someone from U5, is hard to say. But in general, there's probably around anywhere between 10 to 12% of their ancestry being haplogroup U. With, again, the most of those being the Basques and Cantabrians and the northern Europeans, the northeast Europeans, the Estonians, Latvians, the Estonians, Finns, and Sami peoples. And we'll talk about why that is, why they're not more widespread a lot next season with the spread of agricultural groups. But that does leave one final big, I guess, controversy or mystery about England at this time. Again, most people, all the people in that U5 haplogroup, people related to Cheddar Man, however closely or not, are all hunter-gatherers. However, there was some finds on the Isle of Wight, which is that big island directly to the south of the English coast. It's the biggest island in the English Channel, I believe, by a large margin, though there are several smaller ones in that region. They have found evidence of wheat, and not just wild wheat. We're talking wheat that's actually almost genetically identical to wheat that you would find in the Middle East and the Levant. Now, we already know that people coming from Anatolia are probably bringing crops and domesticated strains of animals into Greece, kind of like at the 7,000 point part of our time frame. Remember, just a couple of weeks ago we talked about that, and how it's spreading quickly along the Mediterranean coast all around, and it even probably got to France. However, this wheat shows up on the Isle of Wight right at 6,000 BC. So obviously it's not a people who are traveling that far. There's no reason for people to travel that far that fast at this time. But it does seem to indicate that there may have been extremely long-scale trade routes at this time. Now, obviously there have been trade routes before in human history. We've talked about it. But this would be something that would be incredibly long. Like, it'd be the longest in the world at this point. We're talking about a trade route from, at the least, like southeast Italy to the Isle of Wight. Now, this is a very controversial discovery. There are people who are saying that this is dated wrong. That this is, probably 1,000 years too soon for it to show up. Now, the people who have made this discovery and who are very firm about this date, they are adamant that they have dated it correctly, and they have given their answer to some of the criticisms of their dating methods. And this is done by Michael Balter, I believe is his name. I wrote that wrong. My handwriting's terrible, by the way. And this was found on the Boulder Cliff Mesolithic Village. I'm not going to dive too much into this, but if this is correct, then the seeds being traded along the southern, or the Mediterranean coast along Italy, Sardinia, and all that stuff, these are much more widespread than we have evidence for. It's possible that there is some level of agriculture then all throughout Europe at this point in time. Why it gets to the Isle of Wight at this period, we can't say, but it's possible that these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers are getting these seeds in trade for, various pieces of maybe obsidian, or their other material or foods that they have, and they're given these seeds, and they either don't know how to utilize them correctly and how to plant them, or they fail in the experiment. I personally think there probably is a dating problem, but that's just me. I can't back that up. I can't do any better than the people who have refuted this. And again, Balter has been very adamant that this is the correct date, and I don't know enough to counter any of his claims. So I will say, if it is there, It is a massive find, and it's basically sitting there waiting for someone to basically rewrite the history of agriculture in Europe for a couple of thousand years early. But as we'll see, if these seeds are there, they don't make a major impact on the people living in the region. They won't for another 3,000-ish years, give or take. And why that is of course stuff we'll get in next time. But, well, not next time, but next season when we return to Europe. Now, I think that's probably a good place to call it. I hope I didn't offend anyone with my talk about Cheddar Man. Again, I think just debating about his skin color it serves no purpose. It's kind of stupid. I think the scientists who put that out there, I don't think they had like a nefarious left-wing agenda. But I do think that they were trying to make a splash to draw attention to their research, try to help with funding, that kind of thing. And I do think, and this may not have been their decision, they may have been limited by funds. They may have been encouraged by the journalistic community that they're interacting with to be as sensationalist as possible. But if you actually read these researchers, these scientists, they're not making these wild claims quite the same as the people talking to them are, like the journalists. That's just the problem, big mass corporate media. But yeah, and again, the most interesting things about Cheddar Man, none of it has to do with his skin color. It has to do with the nature of his death, his burial, or his unburial, depending on the case, and how he's related to the people around him, like that kind of thing. So, but again, I would encourage people to look at the reconstruction, the new one. If you Google it, it's the first thing that comes up. Again, I think it's really offensive. I'm surprised that people weren't pissed about it in a different way, because it looks like he is a white guy wearing blackface. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm completely maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe you'll look at it and say, yeah, no, that looks like he doesn't look white at all, or European at all, I should say. But yeah. Now, we are in October. I will be doing some bonus episodes. Like I said, I'll do at least one per week that are quote-unquote bonus. That said, I am doing real episodes at the same time, but I will not be doing real episodes every week. So basically, you have this episode, which is a canon history episode, or prehistory in this case. Then at some point this week, I'll put out a bonus episode. I'm going to try to have it out as early as possible. And then next Monday, we'll have another bonus episode. And then I will do at least one more, probably two more history episodes, in addition to the kind of the spooky Halloween stuff, or fantasy Halloween stuff, however you want to look at it. But I hope you all enjoy. I got a really good reception to last week's episode, and I'm hoping you all enjoy this one too. So thank you all for joining me, for listening, for downloading, liking, subscribing, all that great stuff. If you have any questions or feedback, if you just want to tell me I'm wrong about Cheddar Man, please feel free. You can reach me at war@revpod@gmail.com. You can message me on Twitter via direct message, or X as it's known now. Or you can comment on any of my YouTube videos, which I am uploading. I am also been live streaming fairly regularly for some game stuff on the YouTube channel. If you'd like to drop by and see my ugly mug, comment there. You're more than welcome to. For Halloween, I am going to be playing some horror games as opposed to more history or warfare based stuff that I normally play. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. I hope you'll have a good day and a good rest of your week. But thank you all again. Goodbye.